Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this first webinar in the first trimester of the Level 7 Managing People program. The other two trimesters will be recruitment and development. And in this trimester, there are 6 webinars in total. This is the first one, and this one kicks off with looking at the contract between the employee and the company, and looking on from that into looking at how that grows commitment on looking in detail at the economic contract, the employee contract, but also the psychological contract, that which exists in the minds of the employee and indeed of the manager. And I want to end today with something which gives you a flavour of the essence of management leading into the other 5 webinars. I'll leave you with a couple of models. First of all, I want to look at how the firm comes about. It's academically interesting, but it's also important for the manager to understand, because how the firm sets up in the first place, how the firm starts, helps the manager understand the contract that exists between the employee and the company. Now, how the firm came about is a simple enough question with a very complex answer. And it was first looked at by a chap called Ronald Coase back in I think it was around the 1930s, and he was looking at the question of simply, how is it that this thing that we have today with its employees and contracts and the likes, how is it that that has developed as the thing which we call a company? Now, to start understanding this, the answer to this question, we have to look at the beginning. In the beginning, there's a sole trader, an entrepreneur, who elects to set up, decides that he or she can make money out of supplying stools. And so he or she is going to make and supply stools. They're going to turn the tops, turn the legs, glue them together, and take them to market. So we've got a sole entrepreneur making stools. Now, that's fine, and they may well make money out of that, but as a sole entrepreneur, there's a fundamental limit to the number of stools that the entrepreneur can make. So the entrepreneur starts to contract out parts. They realize that a friend down the road can make legs, and a friend in the next village can make tops, and that they, the entrepreneur, just glue it all together and take it to market. So suddenly they're producing more. And that concept of contracting out can be taken to a huge degree, to the point where you can just have the entrepreneur literally subcontracting to 20, 30, 40, whatever number of people. But for every one of those relationships with a subcontractor, there's what's called a transaction cost, the cost of making that transaction work, setting up the contract, specifying, in this case, the legs, specifying what has to be done. And so we go on, and we get to very quickly to a point where it's inefficient. So at that point, we start to bring people indoors, take some of those subcontractors and say, instead of a subcontract contract, why don't you come and work for me? And that's where we have the concept of an employee. It's somebody who comes in to join the entrepreneur and work for them, to come under their direction. And instead of having this business of invoicing and purchase orders and invoicing, they get a wage. And in return for the wage, the entrepreneur can tell them what to do. And that's a very, very key point. We'll come back to that. Now, that gives us the modern day firm, where what we have is the employee making stuff, and the supplier, who still exists. Maybe they're still there producing specialist stuff as stuff that generally the company would not want to make. But you'll see here that the owners, that entrepreneur and whoever he or she has gone into business with, sit outside the firm effectively. They own the firm, and they are under a shareholders agreement because they all hold shares. They then place people as directors on the board of directors, and the directors elect somebody to be the manager, typically the managing director. Somebody's voted, so one of the directors is voted on as the managing director. He or she then is the orchestrator. He or she is the agent of the directors and effectively acts as agent with the employees. So the employee contract is with the firm, and the manager effectively facilitates that contract with the firm. It's not. So you've got an interesting problem here, because the manager has an employment contract with the firm, with the directors and the owners. The employee has an employment contract, but the manager is effectively facilitating that employee contract, whilst he or she, himself or herself, also having an employment contract. The supplier contract works like it was. And of course, there's this weird one called a worker. UK has some very funny arrangements. We have this person called a worker who sits somewhere between and enjoys some of the benefits of being an employee, but is actually in many ways more like a supplier. I've got them inside the firm, inside the circle, the ellipse, but actually they're in a lot of cases outside. So that's the arrangement. And so what we're talking about here now, and we're going to go on to talk about, is the manager-employee relationship. Now, just to explain a little about the contract. The contract in the case of suppliers, I mentioned, was on the basis of a specification and invoice. It's arm's length. It's economic. You do this for me and I will supply that. Or you supply this and I'll pay you that. It's purely economic. It's at arm's length. The contract of service, on the other hand, for an employee, they come under manager control and they are paid. And it's a contract of service, as distinct from a contract for services, which is the supplier case. So it's the bottom one we're talking about. Employment contracts, then, the key thing about them is that they're a special form of contract. And we have to look at, there's some strange things that also go on in the UK. We have intermediaries often in those employment contracts. And it's worth just noting that in the far left-hand side there, we have the worker or employee. I've used the worker term there in more generic case. But the employee has a contract with the company, and the company has liability to collect taxes on behalf of HMRC. You'll see in the second one, the middle one, there's an intermediary in the way. And the way we can see who the employer is in this case is to look at who the employment contract is with and who has liability to HMRC. And you even get situations in the UK where you have the company contracting an agency who then contract an intermediary, who then contract a worker. And you can see, obviously, that that's quite a long distance. These chains get quite long, and it's not a particularly brilliant state of affairs to have multi chains. But that's not uncommon these days, particularly where that intermediary is the worker's own company. And you very often have people working in their own company. They're an employee of one. They have a services company that just simply facilitates the raising of the invoice, ultimately on the company, but often there's an agency in the way. So just a bit of confusion there. Now, we have two elements to the contract. We have, on the one hand, this screen describes the economic element of the contract. That is the sense of, I'll do this for you and you'll pay me that. That's not, and I'm going to go on to illustrate that that's not the bulk of the employment contract. But nonetheless, there is a contractual element. There's a large part of the employment contract in statute. We write confidentiality agreements or a clause inside inside an employment contract, but actually it's not necessary, because you are bound, employees are bound under the Employment Rights Act 1996, that they will keep their employers' information secret. So there's already that there. We're just reinforcing it. Same with an assignment of invention. The Patent Act 1988 transfers the rights of invention, of intellectual property to the employer. It's just in the employment contract, just as a note to the employee to say, hey, don't forget. On the other hand, there's a bunch of expressed stuff which is not in statute. Restrictive covenants, post-employment agreements that say, if you leave, you will not poach our staff. If you leave, you will not poach our customers. And of course, the other bit that's expressed in the employment contract and is not in statute is, you will turn up here, we will pay you this much, these are the hours of work, etc. So you've got part expressed, but there is quite a lump of the employment contract in statute anyway. There's a non-contractual element, of course, and many HR people would wish to emphasize that things like the policies and procedures of the company, the grievance, the way in which grievance is dealt with, the way in which disciplinary is dealt with, and something like another 20 policies that give guidance, they are by intention not contractual. But on the other hand, of course, woe betide anyone who actually bucks those and goes against them, because clearly they are the policies and procedures that management would wish to say to you, this is what's to be done. And don't forget that the whole point of an employment contract is that the person agrees in return for a wage to come under the direction of the company, and the management, the manager, is the agent of the company. And similarly, all the management stuff, I mean, you don't expect to write everything down in an agreement, in a contract of employment. There is management instruction. Management will come along and say, could you please do that? And we're not going to have that in an employment contract. That's part of everyday management. It's part of the whole business of managers being managers. So there's quite a bit non-contractual. But also there is, so see, trying to turn the paper, quite a lot that is inside what we're going to go on to show as the psychological contract. And I wanted just to say, first of all, a little about commitment, because that's actually what we're trying to get. It's one thing to get an economic relationship. You come into work, I'll pay you this. It's a different thing to get a commitment such that the employee says, I want to come into work. Now, that's a big jump. I have to come into work because you're going to pay me. Moving towards, I want to come into work. And that, of course, the want to come into work, the commitment, is what the psychological contract is all about, and of course what good management is all about. You have to fundamentally get people to want to come to work. That's number one. There are a number of other issues that we'll come to, but number one, you want people to come to work, and you have to do some stuff. It's not automatic. You don't just issue them an employment contract and suddenly they want to come to work. They might need to come to work because they have to pay the mortgage, but that's not the same thing as wanting to come to work. Now, generally, commitment reduces. I mentioned about these different types of contracts, and generally, commitment would reduce as you move out on this circle. So the directors, you would expect, their commitment would be tip top, because they've got potentially, as shareholders, if they are shareholders, they would have an interest, a deep interest in the company. The next level of commitment is the employees, and we'll look in the coming webinars, we'll look at this whole business of commitment and ultimately onto motivation and the likes. But for now, the employees are the next best committed. Then we move out, and I've put agency workers and contractors on that way around. It could be the other way around, but basically you're starting to weaken it. They're more towards the economic until you get to the suppliers staff. And of course, the suppliers staff, in terms of wanting to work in great depth with the managers, they're actually on a contract that says we will deliver the following, and it's their job is to make sure that they deliver what their employer, i.e. the supplier, what their employer has committed to the company. So with employees, of course, the first thing we really want is to make sure that the employees are duly committed. Now, it's a social world. This is one of the things that we have to recognize. And I say it's not all economic. Fundamentally, we live in a social world. Humans are social beings. And so we build something which is built on social relationships, the social relationship between the manager and the employee. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the two like one another. We hope they do. But it does mean that it's a social relationship as opposed to what I'm calling there an economic one. In the social world, we're social beings, and we are looking to build commitment. Ultimately, we'll look at engagement later, but commitment is to the company and engagement is to the job. and we'll look at that in other webinars. So there's this thing then called the psychological contract. It's psychological because it's in the mind of the employee. It's also in the mind of the manager, because the manager expects certain things from the employee, which is not, those things are not necessarily written down. They're in fact not written down. The employee expects certain things from the manager. And what's going on here is that the cognitive human processes are driving people to feel, believe, and have an attitude towards. So the aim of the manager is to do that which is necessary to make sure that the psychological elements of the contract, the bit that's not written, the bit that's below the waterline, and the metaphor here is the iceberg, and the above the waterline is all the economic stuff, the stuff that's written down, and the below the waterline is all the stuff that is not written down. That exists in the mind. And simple things like, I mean, to give you an example of the sort of thing that would perhaps build commitment, is the fact that the job will always exist. Now, there's a fundamental. You get given a contract of employment as an employee. The presumption is that that job will be on offer to you for as long as you choose to accept it. As soon as there's any inkling of a break in that assumption, then your opinion of the company and the psychological contract is damaged. And that's why, of course, there's so many problems when companies get into difficulty. So you see there something that is not written down. It's not written anywhere. There's an assumption that the contract will persist. 2 ticks, I'm just going to cough again. That's better. Right. So you see here the nature of the psychological contract. So let's just stop at that point. We've discussed the nature of the contract between the manager and the employee, well, the firm and the employee, and the manager as agent facilitating that. And we've seen it comprises 2 parts: economic, which is written down, it's all the legal stuff, but then there's this other thing, the psychological contract, which is rather more delicate and can be broken. It's like trust. Trust builds, long time to build, broken in an instant. The same thing with the psychological contract, and trust is part of the psychological contract. So let's just stop and visit one thing before, just to put a bit of a foundation in place for the coming webinars, and ask the question, what is management? What is this agency job? What does it do? What is it about? And I'll use a couple of diagrams. Fundamentally, management is the accepting of responsibility for the actions of others. Now, that's the manager saying, I'm going to get involved with the employees and I will accept the actions, I will accept their outcomes. That means that it's upon me to change those outcomes, for me to instruct them in a particular way, for me to intervene in their lives. So management is the acceptance of responsibility for the actions of others. And the way it's done is, of course, this is the first model, a feed-forward model. The first way it's done is that there is a desired business outcome. The person, and this is looking within the person, as a single individual doing work, there's a business outcome. There's some kind of outcome from their job. The manager is inputting people management interventions. The manager is doing something which causes those business outcomes. And of course, there's a whole lot of other stuff that moderates or improves the effect that the manager is trying to have. Simple things, for example, like let's say a robust and fair pay scheme would reinforce the manager's actions, whereas an unfair pay scheme would damage the manager's intervention and therefore ultimately cause a degradation of the business outcome. So that's the first diagram. You'll see this and you'll see it broken down many, many times. The sort of way that that works is literally you start at A on this graph with your outcomes, and you might elect, or sorry, you start down below A, and you might elect to do something. You might elect to, for example, introduce a performance appraisal system. So everybody's very happy. Performance rises up A, up to the top, and everyone's happy because they get a great focus. They get time with their manager. Their manager's working with them on their future development, and everything's hunky dory. Then the manager thinks, well, this is working so well. I'm going to start putting money out. I'm going to make some kind of performance-related bonus so that if people perform, they will get more money. Well, of course, actually, if you'd thought about it, that doesn't work. Generally, I'm going to make a big generalization there. We can talk about that later. But generally, commission systems are quite difficult. And so we come crashing down B. So the manager thinks, well, that didn't work, did it? And he or she then does something else to rise up to an intermediate point at C. And perhaps he enters into a restructure that gives people new jobs, new responsibilities, and we rise up to D. And hurrah, our outcomes, our performance is up at D. Now, the manager's left with, now what do I intervene in? Is there more to be had? Can I get more outcomes? Can I rise to F? Or am I going to do something which will crash down to E? And so there's this constant idea of doing things and sensing, believing that stuff will improve, and hopefully it will. Sometimes it doesn't. You have to undo what's needed. And we end up with this kind of thing. It's in electrical engineering, it's the feedback control loop. And simply what the manager has is the performance reference. What performance do I want? The performance occurs in the individual. The manager measures the performance somehow and compares it with what they have in their mind as the performance they wanted. If it's the same, hurrah, the performance outcome error is 0 and no intervention is required. If the performance is below that which was wanted, an intervention is necessary and the manager must act. And that's another of the models. So that is the essence of management: the feed forward, the doing things, the intervening, the assessing, the measuring, and the adjustment of the action until we all begin again. And that is management in search of whatever organizational objectives that we have. So there we are. We started with how firms come about, and I gave you a little bit of an inkling as to how you start with subcontracting stuff out to be done. Then it gets so inefficient that you think, well, I'll bring a few people indoors, have them inside my workshop, call them employees, give them a different contract, pay them a regular wage, and suddenly they're employees. Then I looked at the relationship between the manager and the employee and described that as in part economic, but also in part psychological. The psychological, by far the biggest bit, that's full of assumptions. Therefore, that's the dangerous territory. That's where things go wrong. It's rarely in the economic bit, the bit that's written down. It's most of the problems occur in assumptions that people have about the relationship. And then I looked at ultimately the psychological contract, floated that in as the delicate but largest bit, and on to say management. The essence of management is about intervening, sensing, and then re-intervening. And that brings us then to the end of the first webinar. And back over to Sue.